Revenge stories aren't just about payback. They are about broken trust, hidden truths, and emotions that cut deeper than any wound. Each story carries suspense, where betrayal shatters bonds and leaves behind scars that demand justice. These tales unravel the storm inside a heart torn between love and vengeance, keeping you hooked as secrets unfold and choices ignite consequences no one can escape. The night had seemed ordinary, but in Sarah's heart there was already an unease she couldn't quite explain. She sat by the window, staring out at the flickering streetlights, their glow cutting through the darkness like faint reminders of a world that moved on while her own stood still. For weeks she had sensed something wrong. The sudden whispers when she entered a room, the way her closest friends exchanged looks behind her back, and even the tone in her mother's voice, faintly edged with guilt, told her more than words ever could. Sarah wasn't naive. She'd always trusted too much, perhaps believing loyalty was unshakable, especially from those she had devoted her love and time to. But betrayal doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, hiding beneath warm smiles and false promises until it is too late. The moment of discovery came not through confrontation, but by accident. Sarah had been searching through an old drawer for a notebook she thought she had misplaced. In the process, she stumbled across a letter half hidden beneath a stack of papers. At first, she thought it was nothing more than an old bill or forgotten receipt. But when her eyes caught the familiar handwriting, her hands froze. Slowly, she unfolded the paper, her heart racing with each passing second. What she read was not a single sentence of kindness or care. It was a confession of deception, written in rushed strokes, detailing plans that were never meant for her eyes. Her sister had written it to a friend, mocking Sarah, revealing secrets Sarah had trusted her with, and outlining how easily she had manipulated her. For a long time, Sarah sat in silence, unable to process the words that stared back at her. The betrayal hit her like icy water pouring over her head, leaving her numb, trembling, unable to breathe. It wasn't just the fact that her sister had mocked her. It was the realization that the bond she thought unbreakable had been nothing but a facade. Trust shattered, the floor beneath her seemed to crack, and every memory of laughter, of shared dreams suddenly felt poisoned. She tried to remember moments when the truth might have been visible, but the puzzle only grew darker the more she pieced it together. Her mind replayed the last few weeks with a clarity she wished she didn't have. Every secret she had shared, every moment of vulnerability, was now a weapon that had been used against her in whispers and ridicule. She recalled the mocking glances from distant relatives during the family gathering, the hushed laughter she had brushed off as nothing. Now she understood. They had all known. They had all been laughing at her, while she stood unaware in the middle of their cruel theater. The shame burned inside her chest, heavier than any burden she had carried before. Sarah's emotions swung wildly between disbelief and rage. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to confront the one person she had trusted the most. But as the hours dragged on, she realized her voice was gone. What words could she possibly say that would convey the depth of the wound carved into her soul? Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying would make her feel weaker, and weakness was what her betrayers thrived on. Instead, she swallowed the pain, forcing her trembling hands to fold the letter back, though the words were now etched permanently in her memory. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the shadows in her room stretching longer, heavier, pressing down on her chest. Betrayal, she thought, was not just an action, it was a theft. It had stolen her peace, her trust, her sense of belonging. And yet, beneath the suffocating sorrow, a new fire began to flicker. She didn't know what form it would take or when it would rise. But she knew one thing: betrayal did not go unanswered. As the hours of darkness faded into the first rays of dawn, Sarah moved quietly through the house, her expression calm, but her heart in turmoil. She avoided her sister's eyes at breakfast, not out of fear, but because she now carried knowledge her sister didn't know she had. There was a strange power in that. Her sister continued to smile, to chatter, to pretend everything was normal, completely unaware that the mask she wore had already slipped. Sarah studied her closely, memorizing every gesture, every careless laugh. Each detail fed the storm building inside her, transforming pain into determination. She realized that what had been taken from her could not be restored. But something else could be born from it, something stronger, something that would make her sister regret every cruel word she had ever written. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed. But inside Sarah, everything was different. Every sound seemed sharper, every silence heavier. The betrayal was no longer just a wound. It was a seed planted deep within her, one that would grow into something her sister would never see coming. The memory of that day would never leave Sarah. It was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering of family and friends where laughter filled the air and bonds were strengthened. She had even dressed with care, choosing a soft blue dress that her sister had once told her made her look elegant. Sarah walked into the hall with quiet confidence, believing that for once she could simply enjoy being surrounded by people she cared about. But what she didn't know was that the very people she trusted were preparing to watch her crumble, and the stage had already been set for her humiliation. The first signs were subtle, the kind you could dismiss if you weren't paying attention. A few guests whispered and glanced her way, their eyes carrying a sharpness that made her skin prickle. She smiled politely, convincing herself it was her imagination. But the whispers grew louder, the laughter less restrained, and Sarah felt her chest tighten with unease. Her sister, standing at the center of it all, wore a smile that seemed too wide, too rehearsed. And then, with a voice that carried across the room, her sister began speaking, sharing private details Sarah had confided to her in moments of weakness. It started with small things, personal anecdotes twisted into jokes. The crowd laughed, thinking it was harmless fun. Sarah forced a smile, her heart pounding as if trying to escape her chest. But then the jokes sharpened, slicing deeper. Her sister spoke of Sarah's insecurities, mocking her struggles, turning her private confessions into entertainment. The words were laced with cruelty, delivered so effortlessly that even those who should have known better joined in the laughter. Sarah's world tilted. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but her voice refused to come. Each laugh felt like a dagger, each mocking glance like salt rubbed into her wounds. Sarah stood frozen, her hands trembling as her face burned with shame. Memories of trust came flooding back, nights spent sharing secrets in the dark, mornings filled with promises of sisterhood, and now all of it was shattered in front of an audience that delighted in her pain. She could see the smug satisfaction in her sister's eyes, a silent declaration of triumph. For her, this wasn't just a prank. It was a performance, one carefully designed to strip Sarah of her dignity. Sarah's humiliation reached its peak when her sister revealed the most painful secret of all, something Sarah had told her with tears in her eyes, something meant to remain buried in the safe space of sisterly trust. The room fell into shocked silence and then, as if on cue, erupted into cruel laughter. Sarah's vision blurred as she fought back tears, refusing to let them fall. If she broke now, they would win. She clutched the edge of the table beside her, her nails digging into the wood, grounding herself in the only way she could. But while her body was shaking, something inside her was shifting. Humiliation, as crushing as it was, carried with it a strange clarity. For the first time, Sarah saw her sister's true face, stripped of any pretense of love. This was not a slip of the tongue or an accident. This was deliberate, calculated, a betrayal so cruel it demanded a response. And in that moment, as laughter echoed around her, Sarah's shame began to transform into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. She didn't storm out of the room or create a scene. Instead, she stood quietly, letting them believe she was broken, that their laughter had crushed her spirit. Her sister smirked, convinced of her victory, but Sarah's silence was not surrender. It was a mask, carefully chosen, hiding the storm raging inside her. She replayed every word, every mocking laugh, and engraved it into her memory. This was fuel, and she would use it when the time was right. The humiliation lingered long after the gathering ended. That night, Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirror, her face pale, her eyes hollow from holding back tears. She whispered the words she could not say before, never again. The reflection staring back at her was not the same woman who had walked into that room. She was no longer someone who trusted blindly, no longer someone who would hand her secrets to those who weaponized them. She was someone changed, forged in pain, sharpened by betrayal. Though the humiliation cut deep, Sarah recognized its power. It had stripped her down, yes, but it had also revealed the truth about the people around her. Those who laughed had shown their loyalty. Those who looked away in silence had revealed their cowardice. And her sister, the architect of her downfall, had exposed herself as the enemy Sarah would one day confront. For now, Sarah carried her pain in silence, but beneath that silence grew a promise that her sister would never forget. Sarah became a master of silence, After the humiliation she endured, people expected her to retreat into isolation, to hide away in shame, to let the weight of their laughter crush her completely. And in a way, she let them believe that. When she walked into a room, she kept her eyes down. When conversations swirled around her, she stayed quiet. She didn't defend herself, didn't try to argue against the lies or the twisted stories that her sister had crafted so carefully. To everyone else, it looked like she had surrendered, like she was too broken to fight back. But inside, beneath the calm mask she wore, Sarah was building something no one could see. Every night, when the house grew silent, Sarah sat by her window with a notebook and pen. To anyone passing by, it looked like she was simply scribbling her thoughts to cope with the pain. But the words she wrote weren't confessions. They were observations. She documented the looks people gave her, the names they whispered behind her back, the alliances her sister maintained, the patterns in their behavior. It wasn't enough to know she had been betrayed. She wanted to understand how deep it went. Who else had played a role? Who had stood by in silence? Each entry was like a piece of a puzzle she was slowly putting together. During the day, she played her part well. At breakfast, when her sister laughed and teased her with that smug confidence, Sarah forced a small smile, acting as though she was too defeated to care. She listened quietly when relatives asked questions laced with pity, pretending that the humiliation still held her down. The more she pretended to be weak, the more careless her enemies became. Her sister, believing Sarah had lost her spirit, stopped hiding her arrogance. She grew bold, making little slips, saying things too loudly, trusting that Sarah was no longer a threat. Sarah, meanwhile, was storing everything away. Pain became her disguise. Every time someone pitied her, every time they dismissed her as broken, she felt a flicker of power. No one saw the storm brewing inside her. No one knew that the silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. Sarah had realized something important. Revenge wasn't about rushing forward in anger. It wasn't about screaming or fighting openly. It was about patience, about letting the wound fester until the right moment arrived to strike. She carried the memory of her public humiliation everywhere she went. At night, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the laughter ringing in her ears. Sometimes the sound made her heart ache so deeply she wanted to curl up and cry. But instead of letting it break her, she let it fuel her. She repeated the moments over and over, memorizing every face that had joined in the laughter. The more she replayed it, the stronger her resolve became. She was no longer just a victim. She was a woman preparing for war. Her allies were invisible, though she had none in the beginning. She began observing who looked guilty after her sister's cruel jokes, who avoided eye contact, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These were the people Sarah knew she could one day sway to her side, not by asking for their loyalty outright, but by making them realize they had chosen the wrong person to support. She knew that when the time came, cracks would appear in her sister's carefully crafted image, and Sarah would be ready to widen them. For now, she kept her mask intact. She attended family events quietly, nodded along in conversations, and never once revealed the fire burning inside her. Her sister gloated openly, believing she had crushed Sarah once and for all. Friends who once trusted Sarah now avoided her, choosing her sister's side. It hurt, but Sarah didn't fight it. She let them go. She let them underestimate her. Because the longer they believed she was broken, the sweeter her moment of return would be. Alone in her room one evening, Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes, once filled with innocence, now held a sharpness she had never seen before. She whispered to herself that this was only the beginning. She would not remain in the shadows forever. The silence was her shield, the patience her weapon. When she finally acted, she wanted her sister to feel the same sting of betrayal, the same suffocating shame, the same weight of despair that Sarah had been forced to endure. She placed her notebook back in the drawer and turned off the light, lying down with a calm expression. Outside her door, her sister laughed again, mocking her, confident that Sarah was nothing more than a shadow of her former self. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled faintly in the dark. What her sister didn't realize was that shadows move silently, but when they strike, they consume everything. The turning point came when Sarah least expected it. She had grown used to the silence, to walking through her days as though invisible, pretending to be weak while secretly gathering her strength. Weeks had passed since her humiliation, and her sister's confidence had only grown bolder. Sarah watched carefully, but always alone, always in the shadows. She had convinced herself that no one cared enough to notice the truth, that no one would ever stand by her side again. And then, without warning, someone did. It was on a rainy afternoon, the kind where gray clouds pressed heavy against the earth, and Sarah found herself lingering at the edge of the family's old barn. She often went there to think, to write in her notebook, to let the quiet swallow her whole. She thought she was alone until she heard footsteps crunching softly against the damp ground. She turned sharply, heart racing, and there stood Daniel, her cousin, one who had laughed less loudly that day, but laughed nonetheless. Her instinct was to brace herself for another cruel remark, another mocking smile, but instead his expression was different, hesitant, regretful. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, his eyes darting around as though he feared being seen. Sarah said nothing, only stared, waiting for the cruelty to spill out. But Daniel didn't mock her. Instead, he let out a shaky breath. "What they did to you, it wasn't right. I shouldn't have laughed. I'm sorry." The words hit her like a blow, not because of their cruelty, but because of their honesty. For weeks, Sarah had carried her pain alone, convinced that no one saw her suffering as wrong, that everyone had been complicit in her downfall. To hear even one voice admit fault cracked something open in her heart. She didn't forgive him instantly. Her trust had been shattered too deeply for that. But she didn't turn away either. Instead, she listened as Daniel spoke. He told her how he had seen the truth in her sister's eyes, how he realized too late that the laughter that day wasn't harmless. It was venom meant to destroy. He admitted his cowardice, that he had laughed along because it was easier than standing alone against the crowd. His voice shook as he confessed, but there was sincerity in his tone, a rawness that Sarah couldn't ignore. For the first time since her betrayal, she felt less alone. She didn't respond right away. She studied him carefully, trying to decide if this was another trick, another cruel setup. But Daniel's shoulders were tense, his eyes pleading. He wasn't mocking her, he was reaching out. Slowly, Sarah nodded, her voice low but steady. "I don't need your pity," she said. "If you mean what you say, then prove it." Daniel's gaze sharpened, and he nodded without hesitation. "Tell me what you need." That was the moment Sarah realized she had found something she hadn't dared to hope for. An ally. It wasn't forgiveness she was offering him, not yet, but a chance to stand beside her when the time came. And though she didn't reveal everything she was planning, though she kept the full depth of her anger locked inside, she knew this was the beginning of something new. No longer was she fighting entirely in silence. She had a witness, someone who had seen her pain and chosen to stand with her instead of against her. Over the days that followed, their conversations became more frequent, always hidden, always secret. Daniel began sharing details with her, things he overheard her sister saying, little slips of arrogance that Sarah could use. He became her eyes and ears in places she couldn't reach, and slowly a bond formed between them. It wasn't the blind trust she once gave so freely, but it was a fragile alliance built on shared understanding. For Sarah, this was more than just gaining information. It was the realization that betrayal didn't have to leave her completely alone. There were cracks in her sister's control, and through those cracks, Sarah could begin to weave her plan. Daniel's presence didn't erase the pain, but it gave her strength. When she looked at him, she no longer saw just the cousin who had laughed at her shame. She saw someone who had chosen to rise from his cowardice, someone who wanted redemption. And that redemption would serve her well. One evening, as they stood together beneath the fading sunset, Sarah finally allowed herself to say the words she had been holding back. "They think I'm broken," she whispered, her voice steady. "But I'm not. I'm waiting. And when the time comes, I'll make sure they regret everything they did." Daniel looked at her, no trace of fear in his eyes, only resolve. "Then I'll be there when you do." The fire in Sarah's heart, once burning in silence, now blazed brighter. She was no longer just a shadow waiting to strike. She was a storm gathering strength. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. Sarah's silence had been her greatest disguise. But now that she had Daniel by her side, silence began to evolve into strategy. Every word, every glance, every mocking laugh she had endured was no longer just a memory of pain. It was a weapon waiting to be sharpened. She had spent weeks pretending to be broken, convincing everyone that she was harmless, invisible, no longer worth watching. That illusion had given her time, and time had given her clarity. Now came the next stage, the calculated plan. She began by observing her sister with sharper focus than ever before. Every detail mattered. The way her sister preened when others praised her, the smug smile she wore when she thought Sarah wasn't looking, the careless way she let secrets slip when she felt untouchable, all of it became pieces Sarah could use. She noticed who her sister leaned on for validation, who fed her gossip, who spread her words like wildfire. Slowly, Sarah mapped the web of influence her sister had spun, marking the weakest strands, identifying where pressure could be applied until the entire structure crumbled. Daniel became an essential part of her quiet war. He reported back whispers he overheard, conversations her sister had late at night, careless boasts she made about how easily she had destroyed Sarah's reputation. With each detail, Sarah refined her plan, ensuring that when she struck, it would not be with reckless anger, but with precision. She wanted her sister to fall not in a single blow, but piece by piece, until everything she had built was reduced to dust. Sarah started small. Subtle moves, quiet choices that seemed innocent on the surface but had purpose beneath them. She rekindled conversations with people who had once laughed at her, not with anger, but with patience. She listened, nodded, smiled faintly, allowing them to lower their guard. Slowly, she planted seeds, tiny hints of doubt, carefully chosen words that questioned her sister's motives without ever sounding accusatory. "Funny, isn't it, how she always knows everyone's secrets?" she'd murmur with a slight smile, as though it were an offhand comment, almost like she collects them. The brilliance of her plan was that she didn't need to force people to turn against her sister. She only needed to remind them of what they already knew but chose to ignore: her sister's cruelty, her hunger for control, her enjoyment in others' pain. Once those doubts took root, they would grow on their own. Sarah knew from experience how gossip traveled faster than truth, and she would use that very weapon to undo the woman who had humiliated her. Every move was calculated, every word measured. At home, Sarah continued her act of quiet submission, making her sister believe that her spirit was still broken. She let her sister laugh at her, tease her, mock her with little jabs. And all the while, Sarah's mask never slipped. The more her sister gloated, the more arrogant she became, and arrogance was always a crack waiting to be split open. Daniel marveled at her patience. One night, he whispered to her, "You're playing a dangerous game." Sarah's eyes, gleaming in the candlelight, didn't waver. "The most dangerous games," she replied softly, "are the ones worth winning." Her notebook filled with plans, diagrams, names, connections. She wrote down possible outcomes, contingencies for if things went wrong, alternatives for if someone betrayed her again. But this time, she wasn't the naive girl who had trusted too easily. She built her plan like a fortress, layer by layer, ensuring no weak spot remained. The true genius of Sarah's strategy wasn't just in tearing her sister down, it was in ensuring that her sister would never see it coming. She didn't want an open confrontation where words could be twisted and loyalties swayed. She wanted her sister to be undone by her own hands, her own arrogance, her own cruelty. And so, Sarah carefully constructed situations where her sister's sharp tongue and manipulative ways would expose themselves. She encouraged her sister's overconfidence, subtly feeding her opportunities to mock others, to reveal secrets, to flaunt her power. Each time, more people began to see her sister's true nature. At first, it was small, a raised eyebrow here, an uncomfortable silence there, but Sarah knew it was only the beginning. Like cracks in glass, once they appeared, they would only spread. There were moments when Sarah's resolve wavered, when the memory of her humiliation threatened to pull her back into despair. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of that night, of the laughter echoing around her, of her sister's triumphant smile. That memory had become her anchor, her fuel. She would not let it fade until justice was done. Daniel remained her confidant, the one person who saw the storm behind her calm eyes. "You're patient," he told her one evening. "Too patient." "I don't know how you bear it." Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Because I want her to feel everything I felt. Not just once. Again and again until there's nothing left of her pride." The plan was almost ready. The seeds of doubt were growing, whispers spreading, and her sister's arrogance only fed the fire. Sarah could sense the shift, subtle but undeniable. The power her sister once held over the family and friends was beginning to waver. Soon, all Sarah needed was the perfect moment. The spark that would set her carefully laid plan ablaze, and when that moment came, she would not hesitate. The day of reckoning came like any other. quiet and unassuming on the surface. But Sarah had been waiting for it with every beat of her heart. The seeds she had planted were no longer hidden whispers. They had grown into doubts, suspicions, and cracks in the flawless image her sister had tried so hard to maintain. All it needed now was a final push, a moment when the truth would no longer be ignored, when masks would be ripped away and the world would see her sister for who she truly was. The opportunity came during another gathering, much like the one where Sarah had once been humiliated. This time, however, she walked into the room with steady steps, no longer the broken girl who had been mocked, but the quiet architect of a plan years in the making. Her sister greeted her with that familiar smirk, still convinced that Sarah was powerless, still basking in the arrogance of control. But Sarah noticed the subtle changes around the room. People didn't laugh as easily at her sister's jokes anymore. Some avoided her gaze, others whispered in corners, and many of those who had once laughed at Sarah now watched her sister with wary eyes. The web was already unraveling. Sarah remained calm, silent, blending in with the crowd. She knew her sister couldn't resist the temptation to perform again. And just as she had predicted, her sister raised her glass, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Let's have a little fun," she began, her voice dripping with the same cruelty Sarah remembered all too well. She began recounting another story, mocking someone else this time, using the same tricks she had used on Sarah before. For a moment, the room was silent. A few people chuckled nervously, but the laughter no longer rang with the same force. Sarah stepped forward then, her movements deliberate, her voice calm but clear enough for all to hear. "It's strange," she said softly, cutting through the tension, "how you always know just the right secrets to twist into a joke, almost as if you collect them for this exact reason." The room fell utterly silent. Her sister froze, her smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second before she laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Sarah, don't be so sensitive. Everyone knows I'm just teasing." But Sarah didn't back down this time. Her eyes locked on her sister's, unwavering. "Teasing?" she repeated. "Do you remember what you said about me? The lies you spread? The secrets you shouted in front of everyone here?" She let her words linger heavy in the air. "I remember, and I'm not the only one who does." Murmurs rippled through the room. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Sarah and her sister. Doubt, suspicion, guilt, it was all there in their eyes. Sarah's sister tried to regain control, her voice sharper now. "You're just bitter. You've always been too weak to handle a joke." Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement but of triumph. "Weak?" she said softly. "You mistook my silence for weakness. But silence is patience. And patience is power." She turned then, addressing the room, her voice steady and unshaken. "How many of you have been her target? How many secrets has she betrayed? How many of you has she mocked to make herself feel powerful?" The shift was immediate. Heads turned, eyes met, and one by one people began to lower their gazes in recognition. A few brave voices spoke up, small admissions at first, then stronger, louder. They shared their own moments of betrayal, the times her sister had humiliated them, the pain they had carried in silence. Each word was like a stone added to the weight pressing down on her sister, each confession stripping away another layer of her carefully maintained facade. Her sister's face paled, her confidence faltering as the tide turned against her. She tried to argue, to laugh it off, to twist the blame back onto Sarah, but the room no longer belonged to her. For the first time, her cruelty had been dragged into the light, and no amount of charm could mask it. Sarah didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply stood in silence, watching as the sister who had once relished her humiliation now drowned in her own. This was her revenge. Not a scream, not a violent outburst, but the quiet, calculated destruction of the person who had torn her apart. The shame that once belonged to Sarah was now hers to give away, and her sister bore it with wide, panicked eyes as the room turned cold. When it was over, Sarah turned and walked away, her head high, her heart steady. She didn't need applause or validation. Her sister's downfall was enough. The power had shifted, and Sarah no longer carried the weight of betrayal alone. She had endured, she had waited, and when the time was right, she had struck with precision. Her silence had spoken louder than any scream could.